Hello, my name is Kevin Albertson. I'm a Professor of Economics at Manchester Metropolitan University Business School. And I have a particular interest, a long-standing interest, in economic principles applied to social problems. In particular, the whole idea of marketisation and corporatisation of government services. You may have come across a little book, which with Mary Corcoran and Jake Phillips, I edited last year, Marketisation and Privatisation in Criminal Justice. And I hope you'll bear with me if I just share a thought or two about where I see public provision of criminal justice services going over the next few years and where I'd like to see it going. Now, if I can put the government's dilemma in some kind of context, we have been caught, broadly speaking, in a materially stagnant economy for some decades now. Material progress, that is to say, the kind of things we all want, new things. Material progress is becoming harder and harder to find, in part because of financialisation. So with debt, of course, we can kick our financial problems into the future, but eventually they come back to haunt us. You may be wondering why it seems so much more difficult today than 20 years ago. Well, the today we're living in now is the future which 20 years ago's problems were kicked into through debt. The other problem we have, of course, is ecological deficits. We have, well, people talk about the climate crisis, and this is a part of our unsustainable living as a planet. It's nothing necessarily, well, it's not only to do with the UK. Now, the government has to address these issues in a very real sense if we are going to move to a sustainable economy overall, not just in provision of public services, but essentially in everything. We do need to have, if you'll forgive me saying, more for less. That is to say, we need to have a better way of doing things, which is going to be less financially costly and less resource constrained. But this does not necessarily mean markets. It will include markets, but it doesn't mean reliance only on markets. You see, the difficulty with markets from an economic point of view, they require moral constructs in order to support them. But unfortunately, reliance on marketisation actually undermines moral constructs. The reason for that is that many markets are built on competition, and in any competition there will be winners and there will be people that aren't winners. Now, if your income depends on being amongst the former category, it's very, very hard to expect people to play by the rules of the market. I'm not just talking about in provision of public services, I'm talking about in general. We know some of the problems with markets caused, for example, the global financial crisis of 2008, which we still are recovering from economically. Even if we hadn't had coronavirus, we would have had another economic crisis come along in the 2020s. We're due one, and we haven't even recovered from the crisis of 2008. So where does that leave us? Well, if we're not going to get too much more material progress, we have to start thinking perhaps about going back more to reliance on relationships. See, there's an upper limit to the amount of material progress that any economic system can get out of the world. There is no upper limit to the amount of relational goods. By relational goods, I mean people spending time enjoying spending time with each other. There's no upper limit on that. Now, this applies to our entire economy, and of course I'd like to see it applied to probation services as well. So I'd like to see probation moving, as it was when it first started, to a much more relational construct. Not all interactions between human beings have to be transactional, as they are through the market. Relational interactions are actually in many ways more beneficial. Think about friendships. Very few people manage to maintain a friendship that's transactional. A friendship that's relational is better for both people. Now, relational interactions can only be supported at a very local level. So what would I like to see going forward in public provision in general and in probation and criminal justice in particular? I'd like to see far more localisation. I'm not necessarily saying that there should be no interaction with charities, private sector companies and so on, but I think it should be done at a much more local level and with much smaller providers. Smaller is generally better in economics. The ideal economy, of course, is one with an infinitely large number of infinitely small firms. I realise that you're never going to get that in the real world, but the point is that smaller is generally better than larger. So probation services which are more local, which rely on smaller corporations, whether public or private, ideally coordinated also at a local level, and which are much more relational, trying to foster the relationships which will build the kind of society that is going to sustain us, all of us, throughout the challenges to come as we begin to cope with the brave new economic world in which we find ourselves. Thanks very much for listening.